Thanks for joining us on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. Two rival military generals in the North African country of Sudan are vying for control of the North African nation's government, and it's unfortunately led to a bloody conflict that has the potential to lead to a full-scale civil war. Now, joining us to explain a bit more about this conflict and also how it impacts us here at home is CU Denver professor Betcy Jose. And Ms. Jose, we appreciate having you on here for a few minutes of your time and allowing us to get a bit of the insight about this conflict.
Thank you for having me and paying attention to this really important issue.
Yeah, so can you start things off here by giving us a bit of an insight about this conflict from a wide perspective? Why are these two military generals taking what seems to be an internal fight and taking it out into the streets of the capital of Sudan, Khartoum?
Okay, great question. It's really complicated. I'm going to try to simplify it for given the time restraints we have, and I'm probably going to lose a lot of nuance, but I hope I'm going to be able to touch on some of the important points so that we can understand why this is happening. In some ways, we can see the current fighting in Sudan as the product of a political struggle between two generals, as you mentioned. One is General Burhan, who is the leader of the Sudanese army. The other is General Hemeti, who is the leader of a paramilitary group called the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. Now, RSF emerged out of an armed militia that was formed by the former leader of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, that was called the Janjaweed. And the Janjaweed was created to quell a rebellion in Darfur. The Janjaweed have been accused of multiple atrocities against civilians in Darfur, so much so that the International Criminal Court issued an indictment against Omar al-Bashir for crimes committed in Darfur. The United States government actually called what was happening in Darfur a genocide. So the RSF emerged from the Janjaweed. The Sudanese army also doesn't have a great reputation when it comes to civilians. So there's real concerns about the plight of civilians in Sudan if this fighting continues. The reason the fighting is happening now can be traced back to events in 2018. At that time, the Sudanese people took to the streets en masse. They were fed up with the government of Omar al-Bashir, its corruption, its brutality, its incompetence. And the Sudanese army at the time saw the writing on the wall and overthrew al-Bashir on behalf of the protesters. There was pressure to install a civilian government, and that civilian government was put in place, but it was also overthrown in another coup in October of 2021. And that second coup was implemented by both General Burhan and General Hemeti. So they worked together to oust the civilian government. Under international and domestic pressures, the Sudanese army was forced to have conversations, negotiations for a transition back to civilian government. Part of those negotiations included security sector reform. And one of the issues in the conversation about security sector reform was how quickly the RSF would be integrated into the Sudanese army. General Hemeti, for obvious reasons, wanted this integration to happen at a slower pace, but General Burhan wanted this to happen much more quickly. Their inability to agree to a timeline for this integration of the RSF into the Sudanese army is a reason that fighting broke out now.
So interesting. So two generals basically fighting over the timeline about the transition to military, away from military rule to civilian rule, essentially led to this conflict. This has been going on for a couple weeks now. Are we any closer to a resolution? Is one side winning, so to speak, at this point?
It doesn't seem like we're at a resolution at this point. There have been various ceasefires, but they haven't been holding. And as a result, the situation on the ground for civilians is catastrophic. The United Nations estimates upwards of 800,000 people fleeing the conflict. I'm sure we've all seen the horrible lines of Sudanese people fleeing into Egypt or trying to flee into Egypt. Um, Aid agencies, international aid agencies, have either suspended their operations in Sudan or have severely curtailed them because of the security situation. Um, and in some cases, the international community has actually hindered the ability of Sudanese people, Sudanese civilians, from fleeing Sudan. There have been reports of various embassies, European embassies, that have held on to passports that Sudanese people had submitted as part of their visa applications to leave Sudan. Because the fighting erupted so unexpectedly, embassies were evacuated very quickly, but passports were left behind and were not returned to passport holders, effectively leaving Sudanese people stranded in Sudan. So the situation is really dire. We don't see an end anytime anywhere near in sight. And the international community needs to do what it can. If it can't get these two factions to stop fighting in the long term, to at least agree to a ceasefire so that civilians can leave, humanitarian corridors can be established, because civilians are really suffering on the ground.
Question based off of that, based on the international community, is there a specific side that the U.S. government is supporting, and if so, which one?
The U.S. government, so President Biden today, I believe, just signed an executive order opening the door for sanctions to any party or any group that is responsible for the instability in Sudan. At this point, the U.S. and a lot of other countries want stability to return to Sudan. So I think that's the priority right now.
All right, so at this point, it seems like no specific side is being taken by the U.S. government, just trying to end the conflict at this point. Now, without sounding ignorant, I understand this question may come across that way. How does this conflict affect us here in the United States, here in Colorado? Essentially, and again, I mean this as least ignorantly as possible, why should we care about this?
Yeah, it's a good question. Sudan seems so far away. So why should we in Denver, in Colorado, in the United States care about what's happening in Sudan? Sudan, I guess I'll start off with the strategic response, and that is Sudan occupies or is in a part of the world that is of strategic importance to the United States. It has it is important from a military standpoint and also an economic standpoint. It's got a lot of natural resources that are very valuable. Um, and instability in Sudan can lead to instability in the region that can have real consequences for the United States. Um, and I think also from a humanitarian standpoint, I'm not a native Denverite, I'm not a native Coloradan, but in the time that I've been in Colorado, I've been really impressed by the humanitarian impulse in the Denver community. Denver has opened its doors to the persecuted for as long as I am aware, recently as a result of national politics, but also for people fleeing conflicts around the world. Um, the Sudanese people who are suffering right now are people just like us who've had dreams, plans, ambitions. They have loved ones. Um, one night they went to bed in a peaceful country, and in the morning they woke up to war. And I think we can all kind of understand how destabilizing that can be. And so I think, given the sort of humanitarian impulse in the Denver community, this would be a story that resonates with Denver. And I encourage everybody to do what they can to help the Sudanese people.
Absolutely. And to that point, you mentioned the 800,000 people who are estimated to have already left or are in the process of leaving right now. Do you anticipate there to be a potential for a big refugee crisis? And if so, could that lead to some refugees coming here to the United States?
It's quite possible that we would see Sudanese refugees here, partially because Sudan is in a region where their neighbors have conflicts themselves, and they don't have the capacity to absorb large numbers of refugees. Sudan borders Chad, which is not in the best shape to absorb a lot of refugees. It also borders Egypt. It borders South Sudan, which has experienced conflict off and on for the past few years. Ethiopia has been in the midst of a civil war itself. So it's in a conflict ridden region, and it'll be difficult for those neighboring countries to absorb these large numbers of refugees in a very short period of time. So I would imagine that some refugees would find their way to the United States.
And speaking of some of those neighboring countries, are other countries getting involved? You mentioned that the United States right now not really taking a specific side at this point, but Russia, China, neighboring countries like Chad, Egypt, what's their involvement at this point?
So Egypt borders Sudan, and it has been accepting refugees. The Egyptians want stability on their southern border, so they are encouraging the parties to have a ceasefire and to come to talks and come to some kind of resolution. Um, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are also trying to stabilize the situation in Sudan. Sudanese forces have been in Yemen fighting the civil war, which is in Saudi Arabia's backyard, and Saudi Arabia has been fighting in Yemen as well. So that's the reason why Saudi Arabia is interested. And also, Saudi Arabia has been accepting a number of refugees as well. Um, there has been some attention to the Wagner Group, which is a Russian mercenary group in Sudan. It's not clear at this point if they are involved in the fighting, and if they are, how much they are involved in the fighting. They are primarily there to deal with mining gold in Sudan. This is one of the natural resources that Sudan has. That I mentioned earlier, and that gold has been used to fund the Russian war in Ukraine.
Interesting. Anything else, Betcy Jose, that we should know about this conflict and how it pertains to us here in the U.S.?
I just want to emphasize the plight of civilians on the ground. As I've mentioned, international aid agencies have either closed up shop or limited their operations because they are afraid that they are not going to be able to function in a safe environment. And as a result, the Sudanese people are running out of the essentials: water, food, medical supplies. Hospitals have been attacked and damaged. So you can't even go to hospitals if you need care. And this is really the first time in a really long time that the capital of Sudan, Khartoum, has seen this kind of fighting. Sudan has had political instability over the years. Khartoum has largely been protected from that instability. It hasn't really seen fighting of this scale. So Khartoum has been sort of a refuge for Sudanese fleeing from other parts of the country where there has been fighting. This is really the first time that Khartoum has seen this intensity of fighting. So the people of Khartoum, which is a city of anywhere between 8 million to 10 million people, are not really prepared for the catastrophe that is unfolding. Um, they have, in a beautiful way, helped each other. There have been these civilian efforts to provide aid through what are called resistance communities, and they are providing food and water, informing people about safe routes out of Khartoum and out of Sudan. But this kind of civilian-led effort, which I call civilian self-protection, is not sustainable and it's not comprehensive. So the international community really needs to do what it can, and that means, pressuring the warring factions to a ceasefire, going back in with international aid to help civilians on the ground, and anything that we can do to promote that message of our government helping the Sudanese people would be so helpful and effective.
Good information, good context on a unfortunate, to say the least, situation, a growing humanitarian crisis in the northeastern African country of Sudan. But see you, Denver, Professor Betcy Jose. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us and enlighten us about this conflict. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on 9 News Plus Time.
Thank you for having me.